All right. What I want to do is give a quick overview of fungi related to the biodiversity lab where we talked about fungi and animals. And here's a typical fungus. This is an oyster mushroom, called that because they supposedly smell like oysters. To me, they smell like rotten fish. But it illustrates a key point about fungi, and that is fungi are decomposers. So over here, you can see this white material that's part of the mushroom fungus, and it's feeding on this mixture of straw and manure that it's digesting externally, if you will. So, what are some key points about fungi to remember? First of all, they're chemoheterotrophs, just like we are. We use complex organic molecules as a source of both carbon and energy. Fungi do the same thing. But fungi are decomposers, or sometimes parasites. The third thing is that fungi, unlike plants or animals, are basically haploid. Some, such as mushrooms, have cells with two nuclei, and that situation is called heterokaryotic. So heterokaryotic cells have two different haploid nuclei. Fungi typically also have cell walls made out of chitin. And another thing about fungi, as we'll see in a little bit, is that they produce spores either by meiosis or mitosis. So fungi go into spores in a real big way. The only time you see a diploid, a true diploid stage in a fungus, is that you'll get two haploid cells that get together and they'll produce a diploid zygote, which usually does not hang around. So you're not going to see a true multicellular diploid stage in fungi. The other thing is that fungi are involved in many sorts of symbiotic relationships with other organisms. So let's look at the basic characteristics of a fungus. The way the fungus is organized is as a mass of fibers. And a little bit of terminology. Each individual fiber is called a hypha. The whole collection of fibers, like you might see on a bread mold, is called a mycelium. In the case of a mushroom, the mycelium is mainly underground, feeding on organic material, and what we call a mushroom is really a spore-producing body. Typical fungus life cycle, the mycelium can produce asexual spores by mitosis, or you can have several mating strains get together to form a diploid zygote that undergoes meiosis on spore-producing structures or in spore-producing structures to produce haploid spores. So we've got a sexual component to the way fungi reproduce and an asexual component. In either case, you don't see a true diploid multicellular organism. So let's look at some of the spores that we've seen. And fungi are sort of informally classified by the type of spore that they produce. First type is what is called a zygospore, and this is where two haploid nuclei get together, form a diploid zygote, which becomes a sort of persistent resting stage. Bread mold would be a good example of a fungus that has this sort of thing. Another kind of spore is called an ascospore, and so right here, these individual oval structures, these are haploid ascospores, and they're inside of a sac or an ascus. And that's very common in many molds and also in morels, if you're familiar with morels. A lot of people think morels are mushrooms, but they're not true mushrooms. And the other type of spore, which we just kind of mentioned in passing, is called a basidial spore, and that's the kind of spore that mushrooms produce on the edges of their gills. And the spores are produced by two a heterokaryotic cell where the nuclei fuse, give a zygote inside of a special structure called a basidium, and then that zygote immediately goes through meiosis to produce the basidial spores. I think the next slide shows that in just a little bit more detail. Here's the mushroom fruiting or spore producing body. Here is the mycelium, which is heterokaryotic in that each little cell has two haploid nuclei. In the mushroom, at the edge of the gills, two of those haploid nuclei fuse to form diploid nuclei, which are on the edge of these club-like structures called basidia. You get meiosis going on, and here are the little spores. So when you think mushroom spores, this is where they're produced. Big thing about fungi is that fungi have relationships with other organisms. So here is a good example. Here are several different types of lichen. Lichens are associations between a photosynthetic partner and a fungus. Both benefit. The fungus provides the photosynthetic partner with water and minerals. The photosynthetic partner provides organic molecules such as sugars as a source of food for the fungus. And they're intimately connected. So here's an algal cell, the photosynthetic partner, and here are the hyphae of the fungus surrounding that particular cell. There are other sorts of relationships between fungi and organisms as well. So here are some leafcutter ants in the tropics. They cut leaves, obviously, they carry them back to their nest, and they culture a fungus that they use as a source of food. So the leaves are to culture the fungus on. So they're basically farming the fungus. Another relationship is what is called a mycorrhiza, or fungus root. The roots of terrestrial plants typically have fungi that sort of infect them, except this is a mutualistic relationship in that the plants do better in the presence of their particular fungi. Finally, in terms of human uses of fungi, many cheeses, such as blue cheeses, are cultured with fungi, and so blue cheeses of various sorts get their distinctive flavors from the fungi, usually a penicillin-type mode, which brings us to the next relationship between fungi and people. Fungi, of course, being decomposers, oftentimes compete with bacteria. And so here is a petri dish plated, streaked out with a staphylococcus, and here's a penicillium mold. And in between the mold and the bacteria, you see that there's an area where there's no bacteria. The penicillium mold is producing what we would call an antibiotic, namely penicillin. Another relationship between fungi and people involved, speaking of drugs, is that some fungi produce hallucinogenic compounds. So here is a field guide to British psilocybin mushrooms. So if you think shrooms, this is what we're talking about here. I didn't think there were enough of these different species to warrant a field guide, but apparently there is. Another drug-related issue, there's a fungus called ergot, which is the source of LSD. And during the Middle Ages, there were episodes where this ergot became very common, and people would get sort of hysterical and have hallucinations. And it's thought that that inspired some of the more surrealistic type artists during the Middle Ages, like Peter Bruegel, for example. All right, so that's just a quick look at fungi to remind you about what they were out, and this will hopefully help you on your third lab exam.